Welcome to the Banyan Edge Podcast. Here's your host, Charles Sizemore.
Welcome to the Banyan Edge Podcast, America's #1 source for smarter, safer, more profitable investing, where we aim to bring you the very best ideas and the very best minds in the business, completely filter-free. I'm your host, Charles Sizemore, and today joining me is the legend, the man, Mr. Ian King, editor of Extreme Fortunes and regular contributor to the Banyan Edge. Welcome aboard.
Thanks, Charles. Good to see you. What's happening?
Well, not too much, but this week I do want to take kind of go back in time a little bit. So you wrote a piece back in December that we still get feedback from. You really struck a chord with this one. You really kind of riled people up. Again, nearly 3 months later, we're still getting regular feedback. People write in all the time just to give their thoughts about it, just to give us their 2 cents to say, that's right, Ian, I'm with you. You know, the article, the title was appropriately Uncle Sam's Race to Fire China. So you tell me, like, what was it about that piece? Like that it got under people's skin. Like that one really made an impact. Like what was it that really seemed to resonate?
Well, good question. So I think that the U.S. relationship with China has really hit a tipping point in the last couple of years. And, if you think back 40 years ago when China liberated their markets and U.S. and other countries started offshoring manufacturing to China, there was a cooperative agreement between the Western world and China and the rest of Asia. As the Chinese experiment has moved basically 800 million people from subsistence farming into, China's middle class, this agreement between countries has moved from cooperative to competitive. And I think, it really is something that resonates with people because we see it more than ever. One problem that a lot of companies in the United States are having is that manufacturing in China costs have gone up significantly because labor wages have gone up tenfold over the last 20 years. Okay. And that's one of the.
And by the way, that's a really hard thing for a lot of people to grasp. Everyone just imagines China has this inexhaustible pool of cheap labor, but China's actually not that cheap anymore.
Right. I mean, imagine if you applied that same metric to the U.S. worker, right? Let's say a factory worker in the U.S. makes somewhere around $100,000 a year. Imagine a tenfold increase in their labor wages over a decade, right? The factory worker goes from $100,000 to $1 million a year. That's basically the dynamic that happened in China. What?
Yeah, a millionaire factory worker.
Yeah, and so. What we're going to start to see more and more of is that manufacturing moves out of China to other places where it's cheaper. One thing that's happening, especially in the semiconductor market, is the U.S. has sponsored a bill under this administration in order to incentivize companies to build semiconductors here in the United States so that we can basically, win the future, essentially, because everything that we use in our daily lives has some type of chip in it, whether it be a memory chip or a logic chip.
I think that kind of comes back to why this got people so riled up. Got a buddy that had some sort of accident. I don't remember what happened. He had some sort of fender bender in his Volvo. And the car it wasn't even that bad of an accident, but the car was in the shop for over 6 months because they couldn't get the parts because the parts were stuck in China or on the boat or whatever. Like they couldn't get it because like the supply chain was such a mess. And that sort of kind of feeds some of that resentment as well. Plus, think back to the pandemic when that was in full force. We couldn't, all of our protective equipment came from China, the gloves the doctors wore, the mask. That didn't exactly foster this this good vibe between our countries.
I mean, COVID highlighted the failure in our supply chain, right? So in a typical electronics process, there are about 50 points of failure that could happen, right? So if you're missing one component, you might not be able to manufacture whatever gadget that you're trying to make. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 years is that China has had very draconian lockdowns for COVID. I mean, when there was a COVID outbreak in, let's say, Beijing, they basically shut the entire city down, tell people to stay in their homes. I read reports that people were actually being welded into their apartments to stay inside because they were so worried about the spread of COVID. And, we all know we've lived through it here in the US and we got the vaccines and we made it through different waves. China spent 3 years locked down. So if you're a company that's trying to manufacture things in China, you were hit with those disruptions over and over again. So I think that's one reason why a lot of supply chains are moving out of China. This can actually benefit American investors in a way that huge changes in global dynamics have in the past. I call this the fourth convergence. And what's happening is, number one, you have
hold on. But before let's go a little slower here.
Sorry, I jumped the gun, Charles.
I'm so
excited about this.
Wildly excited here. This is the.
I know you want to frame this, but let's do it. All right.
Well, no, you talk about the fourth convergence, but that means there were three before. So let's back up a little bit here. Like what is a convergence? Obviously, convergence is when multiple things come together. But what does that mean for you, and why does it matter? Like what? Give us some background on that.
So in this case, number one, there's some type of government intervention. And I know that Ronald Reagan famously said, the worst thing in the English language is I'm the government, I'm here to help. But that's not true for investors, because there are times when the government can solve a problem better than the private sector can. For instance, take the internet, right? Private companies did not invent the internet, even though Al Gore thinks he did. DARPA invented the internet. Take the idea of electric vehicles nowadays, and the reason why battery cells are so much cheaper than they are. A lot of that stemmed from a government energy program that was enacted 15 years ago to get those battery costs down. We wouldn't have this, new evolution of electric vehicles if it wasn't for investments that basically the government made, where private sector companies wouldn't. The U.S. has a long history of public-private partnerships, going back to the Lewis and Clark Louisiana Purchase, which was basically funded by the government and helped us explore the rest of the country. Think about like landing people on the moon and all the improvements in manufacturing and high tech that came out of the NASA program. So, you can look back and throughout history and see how many times that the U.S. government got involved to make things better or create some type of technological breakthrough. Now, in terms of this convergence, so the first is some type of government stimulus where the government is spending money to create or help incentivize businesses to make things happen. Second is some type of technological breakthrough. Third is the private money coming together in a way that basically ensures that there is going to be some huge change in the future. There's been examples that in the most recent past, there's been basically...
You're talking about the internet. The internet was created by the government, but it became a consumer thing when the Netscape browser was unveiled. That's what made it
I remember those
for you and I to use it.
Exactly. So it was basically the government created something and then private companies ran with it. But there's also times where it's just the government is incentivizing companies, by doing public-private partnerships. For instance, what we're seeing here with the CHIPS Act, $250 billion going into creating more semiconductors here in the United States. What I'm saying is this is going to be a windfall for specific companies, especially small cap ones that are positioned to take advantage of this production coming back to the United States. And in times past, investors have done really well when they've aligned themselves with these specific convergences.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because we had this sort of steam building up over the last, call it 10 years or even more, where things weren't super friendly between us and China. Cost in China were also starting to build up. That was, kind of contributing as well. As you said, the price of labor went up by 10 times. But companies tend to be kind of, you don't turn a battleship on a dime, right? So when your factory is already there, it's not so easy to just pick up and leave. You sort of suffer with higher cost and all the industrial espionage and everything else that is going on in China. You just sort of tolerate it because moving is problematic. But then you had the COVID pandemic and all of the disruption that came with that, all the disruption to the supply chain. That was that final spark that sort of started this exodus out. It started a lot of the re-onshoring into the US. So, and then you had this convergence where now the government's getting involved. They're not idiots. Well, okay, let me back up. Our government, they actually are idiots, but they're not quite as big of idiots as we think they are. They do a few things right. And they saw how vulnerable the country had become to disruption when we get a lot of our, the chips we need for the defense industry, for crying out loud, when even those were coming from China. when vital medicines were coming from China. It created this environment that was really not sustainable. And even, that was enough to get through the remarkably thick skulls of even our government to realize that, hey, we got to do something about this. We need to make some investments. We need to turn this around. And so that kind of comes to that first spark that you had mentioned, that government investment, that government involvement in this. Now, I saw something else. And this may be total just BS. I have no idea if this is true or not, but I read somewhere that the US made a not so veiled threat to China that, if you actually do ever invade Taiwan, we can't tolerate the idea that you're going to control Taiwan semiconductor and all of that. So we'll blow it up before you can have it. So you take Taiwan. Sure. You take Taiwan. Yeah. Okay. I can see what that goes for you. We're going to blow up everything of value there before you take it. So I don't know if that's true.
But you bring up a good point. So like what people need to understand is that why is Taiwan so important, right? 92% of advanced semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan by one company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, founded by Morris Chang. Secondly, 66% of all chips are produced in Taiwan, right? So this is basically the epicenter of semiconductors. And it's an island that China still thinks of as its own, okay? And so the reason why semis are basically urgent and vital to the existence of like our country and our planet is he who controls the prevailing technology of the time controls the world. And this goes all the way back to like early human civilizations where it's like the technology back then was like rocks, right? The societies and the civilizations that could throw rocks the hardest and the furthest won. And then if you look over human history, it became the Metal Ages with iron and steel and bronze. Whoever controlled the production of these military weapons controlled the world. Fast forward to the last century, World War I and World War II were won basically because America could manufacture weapons faster than the rest of the world, which is reason why we defeated Germany in World War I and in World War II, because we were able to produce more here in the US. After that, the Cold War started. It became a race of who could build the most atomic weapons the fastest between US and Russia. Cold War ended when Russia decided that the US has such advanced semiconductors, this is going back in the 80s, that we can't compete with them, right? Because the US can basically calculate our missile trajectory and stop them and be able to attack us faster, and they would win the war. So that ended the Cold War. The next war is all about artificial intelligence, controlling basically artificial general intelligence and controlling these super high-tech weapons that you need advanced chip production for. And one of the reasons why the US has cut China out from accessing these chips is because we're worried about them putting them in missiles. And so a lot of this started back during the Trump administration when they put sanctions on Huawei, which is a networking company, because they didn't want the networking built out in the US to help build out the 5G output, and Huawei, potentially spying on the US, the rest of the Western world. It continued in the Biden administration. When we sanctioned China, we don't allow them to buy any of the super high-end lithography equipment, right, which is made by one company in the Netherlands, ASML, to build advanced chips. They are limited now to importing only 16 nanometer chips or greater, which means that like the super high-end stuff that's in your iPhone and other military applications, China can't access. And on top of that, the US said that any Americans that are working for Chinese companies, if you're a dual citizen, there are a lot of CEOs that are running a Chinese company and they have Chinese citizenship and US citizenship, no more. Okay, so we've completely cut China off, which is, one of the reasons why they're becoming a little bit more of an irritant on the global stage. We are responding by trying to move chip production back to the US by incentivizing companies here at $250 billion. That includes, I got the list right here, IBM's building a $20 billion foundry in the Hudson Valley region. You've got Intel doing $20 billion in Arizona, another $20 billion in Ohio, Micron, another $15 billion investment in Idaho, $100 billion in New York. Samsung is doing a $192 billion plant.
100 billion is just $100 billion, like just
$100 billion. Yeah.
20 billion here, 20 billion there, 100 billion.
$100 billion they're investing.
Those are real numbers.
And I'll send this so we can show to our viewers as well. Texas Instruments, 30 billion in Texas. And so we're going to see more production eventually, and this is not going to happen in the next couple of years, but I think this is going to be just one of these large scale events that just acts as a tailwind, this convergence, for specific small cap stocks in the sector that are positioned to take advantage of what's happening in the United States and how we're going to see this massive shift in semiconductor production. So, that's basically the core of our thesis, the fact that the US and China are at odds with each other. We're firing China. We're not allowing them to have access to these high-end semiconductor chips because we have to maintain military supremacy. And here's how we're doing it. And I outline the companies that people can invest in if they want to participate in this. I don't think this is not going to be something that happens overnight or a month or 2 months, but these are, companies that are poised to see
but that's
their
just
revenues.
You don't want this to happen overnight. This is a nice multi-year, potentially multi-decade trade you can get in on and just ride. This is a long-term investment trend.
The only urgency I would say, and it's a long-term investment trend, so you're like, there's no urgency. The urgency is that some of these stocks are really moving up for the last couple of months. When the market was down December, some of them were still going up. And it's like, if the market takes a breather, they take a breather, but then, the trajectory is higher. And you can just tell that there are larger funds that are now investing in them because they don't care about what price that they're paying essentially for these small cap stocks, because they know 3-5 years down the road, they're going to be a lot higher than they are. The market caps are going to be a lot bigger than they are now.
Well, you see the demand tailwinds, for crying out loud, when you're talking about investing, 10 billion here, 20 billion, throwing out, multiple tens of billions like it's candy. That's a lot.
That's what the government is great at, right? Spending your money.
That's one good thing that is something they're good at, throwing a lot of zeros around.
So I think that is one of the biggest scenarios that's going to play out this decade. There's a famous term from the 2010s that Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz coined, that software eats the world. I believe that 2020 is all about hardware eating the world, which is going to require, higher end manufacturing of chips. It's going to require much more automation, where you have like robots in factories in the United States where we're bringing manufacturing home. And so I think this decade is all about hardware. Hardware also is going to include autonomous vehicles, which, we thought we'd have on the roads by now. They're still coming. There are pilots in multiple cities, which means like you can actually call an Uber and you get like an autonomous vehicle to drive you around. So it's like, a lot of these themes have sort of been dismissed in the bear market. And it reminds me a lot of 2003, where it's like, the internet's nothing. Like, it's just a bunch of Nigerian princes trying to scam us out of our credit cards. But things are still aligned and coming to fruition. You're just able to buy things at a much cheaper valuation than they were 2 years ago.
No, for sure. I think you really kind of nailed it on the head there. That's
with the Nigerian prince idea. How much money have you sent to Nigeria, Charles?
Everything. I mean, it's his rightful throne. I mean, I have to help him get back on the throne. It's for the good of his people, right? It's
amazing that reached like basically 330 million Americans at one point, right? I mean,
everybody knows the Nigerian prince scam. Like it's universal. Hopefully nobody we know ever fell for it, but like everyone at least knows it. Like it's touched everybody.
Do they even have a monarchy in Nigeria?
No, it's a republic. I don't believe they've had a monarchy since British colonial rule. Actually, I think it's been that long.
Anyway,
so there you go. They could have at least said the constitutional president of Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
At any rate, on to more serious topics here. So this idea of the fourth convergence, you're actually going to be speaking about that at length, I believe, tomorrow, right?
Yep. I did a special webinar with John Daly, and please check out tomorrow. I think we'll have a link to it here in the show notes.
Yep, so we'll put a link here so people that are interested can join. So I will say, look, you talk about big mega themes, like big trends that are going to last years, if not decades. Mm-hmm. Globalization was the trend for our entire lives. Actually, we're both in our 40s. For our entire lives, the trend was the world was becoming more and more globalized, more interconnected, longer supply chains. That was it. If you could sum up the last 40 years in one word, it would be globalization. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing now is the beginnings of de-globalization. That this whole thing with us in China, tensions with Russia, all of that is the tip of the iceberg. The bigger story here is we are looking at sort of a right sizing. Globalization probably went a little too far. And now we're looking at what could potentially be decades of right sizing where we kind of get the mix right. And what that means is you are going to, well, right now already labor markets are tight. That's not going, even if we have a recession, we're probably not going to have a lot of slack in the labor market, just because as you deglobalize, as I knocked my mic over, excuse me, as you apparently I'm Italian, I'm speaking with my hands here. But as you as you deglobalize, that makes a lot more demand for production in the U.S., which means, again, automation. You go to Chipotle, they don't make microchips, they don't make semiconductors, but they make their tortilla chips with robots now. That's the degree that American companies are having to go to make deglobalization, basically to function in an age of deglobalization. So this is a big deal. Ian, you really nailed this. You've identified this months ago. Like I said, you struck a chord with people back in December. I really encourage all of our viewers to tune in tomorrow. This is, if you want to look smart, you want to look smart in front of your friends, you'll be able to talk to them about this fourth convergence and deglobalization. So Ian, thanks for joining me today, and good luck with your presentation tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Charles. I really enjoyed it and hope we can have a conversation again in the future.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for having me on.